Biodiversity Heritage Library, or the BHL. Before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live and work, who are the Boon Wurrung and the Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I would also like to acknowledge the First Peoples of every part of Australasia, because that acknowledgement is generally missing from the material that I work with, which is material such as this. These illustrations are from historic journals that were written and published in Europe. They all accompany the very first published descriptions of new species. You can see from the dates that these illustrations are from a time when the animals and plants of Australia were being discovered for the first time by Europeans. The text that accompanies these illustrations very rarely contains any acknowledgement that there were already a people on these lands who had an intimate knowledge of both the biology and behaviour of these species. I'd like to thank Tara Hopley and Philip Bertling for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm thrilled to be giving a Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria science seminar because, as you're about to hear, Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria is an invaluable provider of content to this project. So what is the Biodiversity Heritage Library? It's the world's largest virtual library of biodiversity literature and archival materials. The project exists because the cultivation of natural science cannot be efficiently carried on without reference to an extensive library. This is a quote from Charles Darwin, and I'm sure Darwin would agree that access to an extensive library about biodiversity is now more critical than ever in light of our current climate crisis. I'm sure he'd also agree that over these past few years, when access to physical libraries has been so restricted, it's essential that we can access our library materials online and that these materials are freely accessible for everyone. The extensive library that we've created on the BHL website provides access to materials published as far back as the 1400s. This is the oldest book in our online collection, Pliny's Natural History from 1469. It's the largest single work to have survived from the Roman Empire through to the modern day. This treasure was digitised and contributed to the Biodiversity Heritage Library by the Natural History Museum in London. And this is one of the most recent publications on BHL, which is the 2022 volume of Mularia, the Journal of the Royal Botanic Gardens of Victoria. I will talk a lot more about the garden's incredible contribution to BHL, and particularly this publication, later in my talk. But this is just a sneak peek to demonstrate that we have really old and really new scholarly content on BHL. The London Natural History Museum and the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria are just two of 556 libraries across the world digitising their biodiversity collections and making them available on the BHL website. Together, these libraries have digitised over 60 million pages from over 295,000 volumes. And this incredible resource contains information on millions and millions and millions of the world's species. And all of this information, this foundation of our understanding of biodiversity, is freely accessible online for everyone. Those millions of pages are accessed by millions of people. Since the launch of the BHL in 2006, over 14 million unique users have visited our online library from 240 countries and territories across the globe. I manage the Australian branch of the Biodiversity Heritage Library. We are nationally funded by the Atlas of Living Australia, and we began operation in 2010 with just one organisation, Museums Victoria, here in Melbourne. Museums Victoria is the largest museum organisation in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere, and it has an impressive suite of venues. But this is our library. I use this photo a lot when I talk about the Biodiversity Heritage Library because for me, it really captures why the project exists. Like most museum libraries and herbaria libraries, our library is closed to the public, hidden away behind the scenes. But behind those doors are incredible treasures. Those treasures include our wonderful librarians, and you've certainly got librarians that should be treasured at your institution, but also an incredible collection of rare books and historic journals. Very, very occasionally, special people get to go through the doors into our library. These are some true VIPs. They're our volunteers on a special behind-the-scenes tour of our rare book collection. Museums Victoria Library was first established in 1850 or in the 1850s as a working collection for the museum curators. Over its 170-year history, the library has evolved into one of the best collections of natural history books and journals in Australia. Amongst its collection of over 40,000 titles are some incredibly rare and significant treasures. One of the most significant of these is George Shaw's The Naturalist Miscellany, which consists of 24 volumes published between 1789 and 1813. The Naturalist Miscellany contains scientific descriptions and illustrations of over 1,000 species that were sent to London from around the world in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Each description is accompanied by a spectacular illustration. And because of the timing of this publication, it contains the first published scientific descriptions of many iconic species from Australia, including the first scientific description of any species of kangaroo, the first scientific description of the echidna, and the first published scientific description of the platypus. I like to think of these species' international debuts in the literature. They were very weird, and people in London couldn't believe their eyes when they saw these. Their descriptions are really worth reading if you want to go and look at these books on BHL. Our National Digitisation Lab is still based at the Melbourne Museum, where we digitise both journals and rare books. On the right is Ellie Wallace, who started the BHL project in Australia, and she continues to champion it in her role with the Atlas of Living Australia today. On the left is our digitisation technician, Nick Bumek, and we also have a data support officer, Marina Hunt, who's a trained librarian. And fabulously, we also have a fantastic team of volunteers. We currently have 13 volunteers who do some of our scanning, as well as the majority of the cropping and post-processing of images. They also do the critical work of adding bibliographic and page-level metadata to the content that we upload online. I joined the BHL project in October 2014. By then, BHL Australia had grown from one organisation to 4. We'd been joined by the Australian Museum in Sydney, the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, and the Queensland Museum in Brisbane. All of these museums were located in southeastern Australia, and they all focused, as far as biodiversity was concerned, on zoology and paleontology. We were missing plants. So when I first started, a big part of my role was to increase our breadth, both geographically and taxonomically. Then in 2015, not long after I started, it was announced that our Museums Victoria Library would be moving to another part of our museum. At the time, the BHL operation was located in the library, and we were told that we would have to shut down for at least 6 months. But out of adversity comes opportunity. Also in 2015, Ellie Wallace and I attended a tour of the National Herbarium at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria, given by Pina Milne as part of the Museums and the Web conference. Pina mentioned how wonderful it would be to digitise the rare books and old journals in the herbarium library. But alas, the rare books couldn't travel off-site. BHL Australia was homeless, and the Royal Botanic Gardens needed an on-site digitisation operation. So at the end of 2015, we moved our entire scanning operation, our staff, our volunteers and our equipment across the city to the National Herbarium of Victoria to digitise the State Botanical Library collection. We were there for 5 months, and we still refer to this glorious time as BHL's summer sabbatical. Here we are in your library, occupying the space just outside the librarian's office. Sally Stewart was the librarian at the time, and we were indebted to both Pina and Sally for accommodating us during this period and for all the botanical knowledge we were able to make available online while we were there. We digitised many of your journals, including Malaria, and quite a number of old and fragile titles. Our favourites were the Beekeeper's Journal and the Chemist and Druggist, which were both published in the 1800s. Our volunteers still talk about the wild remedies and the crazy advertisements from the Chemist and Druggist Journal. We also digitised a significant proportion of your rare book collection, including A Voyage to New Holland in the year 1699 by William Dampier, which remains the oldest volume contributed to BHL by an Australian organisation. William Dampier collected plant specimens during his 1699 expedition, and A Voyage to New Holland is the first book known to include published drawings of Australian flora. And it's wonderful that this is now available online. Other treasures contributed to BHL from your state botanical collection include Fragmenta Phytographiae Australiae, published between 1858 and 1882. This publication included many of the 2,000 or so new Australian plant species published by Ferdinand von Mueller, and it is Australia's only scientific periodical printed entirely in Latin. We also digitised the Proceedings of the Zoological and Climatisation Society of Victoria, which lists both the species liberated in Victoria for the purpose of making Australia more like England and the Australian species that were sent elsewhere. The volumes chronicle the numbers and dates of the devastating introductions of everything from rabbits to blackberries, as well as Victoria's role in spreading our destructive species elsewhere, such as brush-tailed possums to New Zealand, which we sent over in numerous batches. Not long after that was published, efforts were made to eradicate some of the non-welcome introductions into Victoria. The Thistle Act of 1890 required the eradication of invasive thistle species from Victoria, and this illustrated description of thistles, another beautiful volume from your collection, published in 1893, was meant to be a guide to help landowners identify invasive thistles and remove them. My favourite publication that we digitised from your rare book collection is this spectacular volume of illustrations from the Flora of New Holland by Ferdinand Bauer, which was published in 1813. And I realised when I was putting together this presentation that these are the only photos I have of Sally Stewart from the whole time we were on site at the gardens. So I feel like there's some metaphor here about what good hands we were in while we were there and how beautifully those hands cared for your wonderful library, as her hands are the only things I have photos of. We're very grateful to Sally for having us in her library throughout this time. BHL Australia moved back to Museums Victoria in 2016, but we have continued to have a really lovely working relationship with your library. Librarian Philip Bertling, who's now a good friend of ours, takes great care boxing up material from your general library collection for us to take back to the Melbourne Museum for scanning. Basically everything I request, he goes above and beyond to try and find it for us. We visit every few months to collect boxes from the Herbarium Library, and this has greatly strengthened the relationship between our librarians. This is Museums Victoria librarian Gemma Steele, who's talking to Philip about the long entwined histories of our two libraries. It's really fascinating to listen to these librarians when they get together. RBG Victoria is now the second largest BHL contributor after Museums Victoria, which hosts the project, and it's the primary contributor of botanical material. As of this month, we've digitised over 63,000 pages from the State Botanical Collection of Victoria. All of those pages and the botanical knowledge they contain are now freely accessible online for everyone. So once we returned to Melbourne Museum in 2016, I continued my efforts to expand BHL's taxonomic and geographic breadth. My desk frequently looks like this, covered in boxes of library materials that have been sent to us from around Australia to digitise and put online. Most organisations are not comfortable putting their rare and fragile material in the post, but some have elected to personally deliver their rare or fragile library materials to Melbourne, and others have couriered rare material to us. We are currently digitising a collection of field diaries and correspondence from the Queensland Museum archives that they sent to us via a professional art courier. However, most of what we receive from interstate are journals, and we're really thrilled to be able to make these journals accessible. Many of them are available nowhere else online, even the very recent ones, and some really are quite old. For example, this is the very first volume of the Australian Museum Memoir, which was published in 1851. And wherever possible, we try to complete our journal runs from volume 1 all the way through to the current day. So here, for example, is the latest issue of the record of the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery, which was published last year. A few of our more well-resourced contributing organisations have their own digitisation operations, and they're able to send us digital copies of their beautiful rare publications. These lovely librarians are from the State Library of New South Wales, who've contributed some very special treasures from their collection. So everything was going extremely well for BHL Australia until March 2020, when I had to send our staff and our volunteers home. For a full 8 months of 2020, we were unable to access our scanners or our library materials, and 2021 wasn't much better. With our digitisation operation shut down, we had to find work that we could do from home. This provided a unique opportunity to step back from our everyday workflow and to find new ways of making biodiversity literature accessible and to make our existing content more discoverable. Anyone who's met our BHL Australia staff, and particularly our volunteers, will know that there's no stopping them. Within days of me sending them home, several of my volunteers contacted me asking how they could continue to contribute virtually. This was before I'd worked out what I was going to be doing from home. We were locked down, but we still had a willing and dedicated workforce. The first thing I did, once the dust had settled, was to contact all of our existing contributors to ask if they had any born digital or previously digitised content that we could upload. Prior to this, we hadn't done much of that very, very recent material. And then I started contacting potential new contributors. I almost cried reading the generous replies that rolled in. 22 organisations, including 7 new contributors, responded to our pleas for digital content. We were still in business. We could not scan anything ourselves, but we could still make other organisations' content discoverable. 2020 wasn't so bad after all. Despite the fact that we were completely locked down for 2/3 of the year, 2020 was our second best upload year ever. We made over 50,000 pages of Australia's biodiversity literature accessible on the BHL website, which was only an 18% drop from 2019. In October 2021, Melbourne was declared the world's most lockdown city. But despite this, our Melbourne-based operation uploaded more pages in 2021 than any other year ever, including last year. Scanning physical books takes more time than uploading born digital and previously digitised material. So once we returned to work, our output dropped a little. In 2022, we digitised just shy of 63,000 pages, which is not too bad. So since 2014, we've grown considerably from those 4 organisations. BHL Australia now consists of 42 contributing organisations across the country. So we're now a truly national project with organisations contributing biodiversity knowledge from every state and territory across the country. These organisations include our state museums, state herbaria, state libraries, royal societies, government agencies, field naturalist clubs, and other naturalist history clubs and societies. And we've definitely got the plants covered. The organisations highlighted here are either our state herbaria or societies that focus specifically on plants. Many of our contributing organisations would never be resourced to do this work themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the BHL Australia project is nationally funded by the Arts of Living Australia, and we cover all the costs of digitisation, metadata collection, file management, and website wrangling, as well as making the online content, as accessible and discoverable as we possibly can. So as of this year, every Australian state, territory, and national herbaria is contributing the back issues of their in-house journals to BHL, many up to 2022. We've made a special collection on BHL called Australian Botanical to gather all of this Australian botanical taxonomic literature together. The National Herbarium Victoria is down on the bottom left there. I'll just zoom in so you can see it better. You'll see here that there's a link to malaria, so users can link directly through to that title, and also links to 2 other collections that we made when we were on site in the Botanic Gardens. The first is called the Botanic Gardens Melbourne, which is a collection of the reports, catalogues, essays, notes and correspondence that were authored by the directors of the Botanic Gardens Melbourne between 1852 and 1899. And that second collection is the Ferdinand von Mueller collection, which contains all the books, correspondence, papers and essays that von Mueller produced while he was the government botanist of the colony of Victoria and then the director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. So these collections contain the material that we digitised while we were on site at the gardens in 2015 and 2016. There's Ferdinand von Mueller. So thanks to the contributions of our now 42 Australian contributors, BHL Australia has made over 500,000 pages of Australia's biodiversity literature openly accessible online. We hit that milestone just last month, 500,000. So that's exciting. So all of this is accessible. But accessible doesn't equal discoverable. Just because we put something online doesn't mean people can find it. Our other important focus during the pandemic was making our current content more discoverable. And this has continued to be a very important part of our work. This is another journal contributed from your state botanical collection, the Australian Orchid Review, which has these beautiful hand-painted title pages. And something we'd never seen before, perfume slips bound into the volume. So these are just like what you get handed if you walk through Myer or David Jones in Melbourne, and they're bound in and they're kind of incredible. This is the landing page on BHL for that journal. Now, BHL is traditionally a library project. When we upload an item onto BHL, it's accompanied by data from its library catalogue, from that library catalogue record. And that then creates a BHL catalogue record, which is searchable both within BHL and via external search engines. Now, this is really useful for librarians. It means you can search the title of the journal as well as the volume number and the publication dates. However, this data tells us nothing about what's inside those volumes, which means it's not very useful for anyone other than librarians. The bibliographic unit of most interest to researchers and academics is not journal titles or volumes, it's the articles. Most academic work is published in academic journal articles, and thus most citations in journal articles are other journal articles. Article data includes specific publication dates, authors, and article titles. And article titles are particularly useful because they include subject-specific information, such as common names, scientific names, place names, details of anatomy, and even the names of eminent collectors and organisations. This article, for example, which describes my favourite Australian marsupial from a specimen that was sent to the British Museum by Alfred Russel Wallace from the Aru Islands. All of that detail is in the title. Post-lockdown, BHL Australia spent a lot of time digitising orchid journals in response to an urgent request from researchers studying the impact of Australia's 2020 bushfires on our native endangered orchid species. These orchid species, or these orchid journals, are full of critical information about past distribution and abundance. But in order to find information about individual species, researchers needed us to be able to make it available, or be able to make it possible for them to search for specific articles within the journal volumes, specifically those article titles and the keywords that appear in those titles, particularly the scientific names. Before I continue, I have to acknowledge that BHL has incredible search functionality within its own website, including full text search, which searches the OCR text across all 60 million pages on BHL, and taxonomic name recognition, which searches the OCR text for scientific names of animals and plants and compares them to a repository of accepted scientific names, and it allows you to link out to databases that hold those names. If you don't know about those invaluable tools, I encourage you to check them out. However, those tools only work within the BHL website, and if you want your content to be truly discoverable, you need to be discoverable via the tools your primary audience use to find stuff online. I would argue that if external search engines can't find our content, we may as well have left it on a library shelf. If we want to make the content locked up in BHL discoverable via external search engines, we need to add article data to BHL and make the article publications in their own right within the BHL catalogue. So to quote one of our orchid researchers, Heidi Zimmer, this is the information we need to refer to when we're doing a conservation assessment of species towards having it listed as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. She needed to be able to link to those articles and primarily to find them. It's thus critical that we make the articles on BHL discoverable and easily citable. So this is what BHL Australia staff and volunteers did throughout the long Melbourne lockdowns. We gathered, checked, and gap-filled the data for thousands and thousands of journal articles, including this one, again contributed by your library. Adding the article data to BHL made that biological knowledge locked up in the articles discoverable both within and outside BHL. So now if you do a Google search for something like Antarctic lichens on the Windmill Islands, you'll find that the first returned result is an article on the BHL website, published in 1974 in the journal Malaria. This is one of a series of 6 articles in Malaria about Antarctic lichens, and we've connected them all in BHL so users can easily click from one to the next. And now we've added the article data to BHL for every article published in Malaria up to 2022. This means that every article has its own landing page like this one, complete with that article data. BHL landing pages are created automatically when we upload the article data into the back end of BHL, and this makes the articles discoverable both within BHL via the BHL catalogue and outside of BHL via external search engines, as well as by all the algorithms and bots that link online content together. And this is becoming more and more important. For these landing pages, users can link directly through to the first page of the article, or they can download a pre-generated PDF of the full article. Pre-generated PDFs are a relatively new feature on BHL, and they bring BHL in line with modern publishing standards. So while my BHL Australia team was busy working on article data, I focused on taking article discovery to the next level by retrospectively assigning DOIs, or digital object identifiers, to the journal articles on BHL. To demonstrate why it's so important for the legacy literature to have DOIs, I'm going to use a modern journal article. This beautiful creature popped up in my Twitter feed in 2018. It's the announcement of the discovery of a new species of pygmy seahorse. In the tweet is a DOI, and if I click on that DOI, I'm taken directly through to the primary literature, to the published taxonomic description of that species. That DOI is a unique, permanent, and persistent link to this journal article. And if I want to know more about pygmy seahorses, I just have to scroll down to the references. And there I'll find more DOIs. Persistent links to other journal articles, and I can click on all those DOIs and read all those papers without leaving my desk, which was super useful during lockdown. But there are DOIs missing in that list. The older articles don't have DOIs, and that means it's much easier for readers to access recently published articles, and thus authors are much more likely to read and cite the new stuff. The historic literature is in danger of falling into obscurity without DOIs. It was quite a different story when I was at university in the 1990s. If I wanted to read a journal article, I went to the library. And it took the same amount of effort to find a modern article as it did a really old one. I just moved further along the shelf. Things have definitely changed. All elements of modern academic research can now be linked via persistent identifiers. This diagram represents the links that should be present between biodiversity information online. The concept of this biodiversity knowledge graph was published in 2016 by Professor Rod Page, who I imagine some of you know. I'm particularly interested in this part of the knowledge graph, and I'll talk more about links between that part of the knowledge graph and taxonomic names. The problem with the historic literature is that, for the most part, it lacks DOIs, and thus sits outside this linked network of scholarly research. So if we want the historic literature to be discoverable, persistently citable, it needs DOIs. So in 2020, I established an international working group to retrospectively assign DOIs to the legacy literature on BHL. Since then, we've assigned thousands of DOIs to historic journal articles. This was one of the very first, and it's become the mascot of our work. It's the first scientific description of the duck-billed platypus, which was published in 1799. I tweeted that we'd assigned a DOI to this article in 2020, and I got some pretty enthusiastic responses. Both the idea of this, DOIs for all, and its actual content are absolutely brilliant. The description of the platypus is just fantastic, which it is. I encourage you to go and look. Good to know that an article published in 1799 can be assigned a DOI. Links like that are essential for citations and cross-referencing. It's new to me that BHL gives DOIs to its papers. Really cool, because it follows that the web of citations becomes so much more complete. And now we need this for every other species in order to finally get non-taxonomists to cite our taxonomic papers. And then finally, RetroPIDs, which is the hashtag I came up with for our retrospectively assigned persistent identifiers, are such a fantastic idea. And because this platypus article now has a DOI, we can track its impact and reach. The DOI tells us that this 1799 article has been mentioned in 333 tweets. Most of those are mine, 10 Wikipedia pages, a blog post, a news story, and 3 academic papers. I actively track the performance of some of these new DOIs, and I get notified of their research output. I was so excited when in 2020 I got a notification saying that this paper had been cited in an academic paper using its new DOI. But then I was blown away in 2021 when I got a notification that it had suddenly been cited in a publication from 1999 and another from 1995, citations using the platypus's DOI over 20 years before we'd assigned it. It turns out that the publishers of these 1990s articles, Oxford Academic and Elsevier, had rerun their citation indexing, and I found out that this is something that they do regularly. So this resulted in our retrospectively assigned DOIs being retrospectively linked to these old citations. So our DOIs were popping up in articles that were published in the 90s, the 80s, and even earlier. Some are even from the 1800s we found, which is so exciting to see a DOI in a citation list on a commercial website like this. So this boosted our citation statistics, and it totally made my year. So since assigning a DOI to this platypus description, we've assigned thousands more, including these, the first published descriptions of the waratah and the hairpin banksia, published in 1793 from James Edward Smith's Specimen of the Botany of New Holland. They now have DOIs, and they can be persistently linked to from modern citation lists, with these spectacular illustrations by James Sowerby. Anyone can assign a DOI to an out-of-copyright article, but if an article is in copyright, you need permission from the rights holder. Thus far, every rights holder we've asked about assigning DOIs to their back issues has responded with an enthusiastic yes, please. And these rights holders include the Natural History Museums in London, Paris, and Geneva, Harvard University, and just recently, the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature. So all the articles in that journal will soon have DOIs, and I'm hoping that makes some people in the audience happy. And also in that list is the Royal Botanic Gardens of Victoria. So we now have DOIs for this 1979 article introducing 12 new genera of cyanobacteria described from the Seine in Paris, from the Bulletin du Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle with permission from the Natural History Museum in Paris, and also this 1955 article in Mularia describing a new species of orchid. Now, every article ever published in Mularia up to 2022 now has a DOI, making these articles persistently citable and trackable within the modern linked network of scholarly research. Now that they have DOIs, we can track their impact and their reach via citation statistics and altmetrics. For example, this 2014 Mularia article about Ferdinand Müller's female plant collectors has been cited in 5 other scholarly publications, including this one. The DOI in the citation there is a persistent link, which allows users to click directly from the reference list through to the article on BHL, which I encourage you to read because this is a fascinating insight into your institution's history. The articles in Mularia have only had DOIs since mid last year, but I can tell you that as of this morning, those DOIs have appeared in the reference lists of 298 other articles, including this one published this year. This is proof of the ongoing relevance and impact of your institution's long research output, not that you need it. Another place you'll find your Mularia DOIs popping up is in our taxonomic databases. Last year, we got in touch with Anna Munro and Anne Fuchs from the National Species List and the Australian Plant Names Index. We asked them to provide us with a download of all the existing citations and microcitations in the National Species List for both Mularia and Nootzia, the Journal of the Western Australian Herbarium. These original citations in the National Species List had been manually entered by many different taxonomists, and they varied enormously in their format, accuracy, and completeness. We mapped those existing citations to their new DOIs for each article and microcitation, and we delivered back to the National Species List clean and consistently formatted citations complete with DOI links generated from the bibliographic metadata that we had pulled from Crossref, the DOI registration agency. So now, if you're looking at a reference in the National Species List for either a Mularia or a Nootzia article, you'll see a DOI symbol. And if you click on that DOI, it'll take you directly from the taxonomic database to the literature, which for Mularia is on BHL. And finally, the place your content really needs to be for people and for search engines and bots to find it is Wikipedia. This is where having a DOI really helps because adding a citation to Wikipedia is super easy if the publication has a DOI. Wikipedia has an automatic add a citation function. All you have to do is paste a DOI into that box and all the bibliographic metadata, beautifully formatted, is attached to the DOI and turned into a consistently formatted citation with a direct link through to the literature. And that's all I had to do to add this citation to the Wikipedia page for the illustrator of that beautiful platypus, Frederick Polydor Nodder. It would have taken me a lot more time to add the citation manually, and again, it would have been probably inconsistently formatted against other citations in that list. So having DOIs on our articles really helps Wikipedians make our content discoverable. So the new Mularia DOIs are popping up all over Wikipedia on the profile pages of species and authors and collectors and illustrators and institutions. And again, users can link directly from these links through to the literature via those DOI links. That link, for example, takes you through to this Mularia article from 1988, which describes new species of Buckinghamia and Stenocarpus from northern Queensland. So this is the final article that I'm going to share with you. It's a modern one, published in 2019. It's called An Historic Insight of Population Changes of the Platypus Across Time. In this article, the authors state that evidence for decline in abundance and distribution is critical, possible only through the inclusion of historic information. So this is why the BHL is such an invaluable resource and why it's so important that the knowledge within its 60 million pages, growing more than 60 million pages every day, is discoverable and persistently citable. So that's what we do at BHL. We make the foundation of the world's biodiversity knowledge accessible and discoverable, and we link it through to the modern scholarly research so that we can continue to build on that knowledge today. So if there are people in the audience listening from institutions who are not yet contributing to BHL or would like to assign DOIs to their publications on BHL, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. And if you want to help gather or check article data for the journals you've contributed or the journals you read, or there are titles that you want us to add to BHL, we'd love your help and your contributions or your advice or your ideas. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. So thank you again to the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria for your tremendous contribution to BHL and for inviting me to speak to you today. And thank you all for listening. I'm very happy to answer any